Good morning. I'm Bernie Niemeyer, the president and publisher of Virginia Business Magazine, and I'm delighted to be here today to welcome you to our 14th annual Political Roundtable. You know, when I think back to our first time in 2007, George Bush was still in the White House, Tim Kaine was still the governor of Virginia, and we were in the basement of the Capitol Suites Hotel near the Capitol in downtown Richmond. It was a cold November night. We had a few panelists in the room for editors. We didn't have a live audience, but we did have video. So this is not unprecedented for us to be doing this by video. When we think about the importance of our elections in Virginia, and we have one every year in Virginia, it makes a difference to the business community, what happens in the General Assembly, and how that affects the economy of our Commonwealth. So for those of you who are political watchers, I'm delighted to have you here today. In a few minutes, you'll hear from our editor, Richard Foster, who will introduce this year's panelists. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Cox Communications, our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Neka Chiazor, Regional Vice President of Government and Public Affairs for Cox in Virginia. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 13th annual Virginia Business Political Roundtable. At Cox, we have a long history of championing inclusion, diversity, and civic engagement. You know why? It's because our founder, Governor James M. Cox, ran for president alongside Franklin D. Roosevelt 100 years ago this year. Yes, Franklin D. Roosevelt was his running mate. Now, clearly they both lost. If not, I wouldn't be here today representing Cox. But that passion and commitment to patriotism and civic duty runs through our roots to this day, and it's reflected in our purpose, which is empower people today to build a better future for tomorrow. I'm incredibly proud to work for a company that values civic engagement like Cox does. As diversity and inclusion champions, we at Cox recognize the importance that politics plays in fostering inclusion. We understand that we simply cannot have an inclusive society without politics. That's why we continue to be proud sponsors of this event and supporters of the Virginia Business Magazine. As a global company, we want every person to feel empowered to stand up for what they believe is just and right. In addition to strengthening our partnerships with Rock the Vote and Time to Vote, every Cox employee receives 6 hours of paid leave to go vote in yesterday's election. We also took the no meetings pledge. Yes, at Cox, there were no meetings unless business critical that took place yesterday. We did that in furtherance of our belief in supporting civic engagement for our employees because we recognize the importance that politics plays in fostering inclusion. And finally, through our Actions Speak campaign, a company-wide campaign that aims to drive and foster more inclusion in our company, we pledged $60 million to bridging the digital divide. Why? Because we want every American to have the knowledge and access they need to exercise their right to vote. Now, I have to confess, I'm a political enthusiast. Some folks on my team call me a political junkie, but that's okay. The first Tuesday of November every year is my Super Bowl, and I own that completely. My husband knows to leave me well alone as I excitedly yell at Wolf Blitzer. Yes, I get so excited I can't even say his name. At Wolf Blitzer, at Tucker Carlson, and anyone that I can get my hands or face on while the election results are coming in. They can hear me loud and clear through the screen. So like all of you watching today, I'm so looking forward to hearing from editor Richard Foster and our fantastic panelists. 2020 is history in the making, and the year isn't even over. So I'm sure there is a lot to discuss. So without further ado, Richard, please take it away.
Good morning. Welcome to the 2020 Virginia Business Political Roundtable. I'm Richard Foster, editor of Virginia Business Magazine, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. A deeply divided America went to the polls yesterday amid a pandemic year unlike any in memory. The results of the presidential election are still being determined. President Donald Trump prematurely declared victory early this morning and said he would petition the Supreme Court to order states to stop tallying votes. Meanwhile, his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Joe Biden, said it ain't over until every vote is counted. Here in Virginia, the Commonwealth held on to its relatively new status as a blue state, but some of the congressional races may be showing that Virginia isn't as blue as Democrats would like to think. So we have a lot to discuss today, and without further ado, I will introduce our 5 panelists. First, Ben Dendy is president of Vectre Corporation, a Richmond-based lobbying firm. He has served as Virginia's Secretary of the Commonwealth, Secretary to the Governor's Cabinet, and is a special assistant to the Governor. He serves as Vice Rector of Virginia Commonwealth University. Next, we have Jim Dyke. He is Senior Advisor for State Government Relations at McGuireWoods Consulting. A longtime influential figure in Virginia politics, he served as Secretary of Education under Governor Doug Wilder, and currently is a member of the State Board of Go Virginia. He has been appointed to boards or commissions by every governor since Chuck Robb, Democrats or Republicans. Stephen Farnsworth is a professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Mary Washington, and he serves as director of the university's Center for Leadership and Media Studies. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, most focusing on the American presidency. His political commentary has appeared in media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Politico. Mark Rozell is the founding dean of George Mason University's Schar School of Policy and Government. He holds the Ruth D. and John T. Hazel Chair in Public Policy and is the author of 9 books about American politics and the presidency. A frequently quoted pundit, his comments have appeared in publications such as the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and The Hill. Amanda Wintersieck is an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University. Her research focuses on the roles that political campaigns and the media play and how voters make their choices. Her work has appeared in publications such as the London School of Economics, American Politics, and Policy Blog. Now, let's begin with the question on everyone's mind. Are we headed for a scenario like the 2000 Bush-Gore race, which was essentially decided by the Supreme Court? Who would like to start?
Well, I hope we're not headed in that direction. I hope that once we get all the votes counted, we'll have a clear winner and that there will be a respect for the fact that the process has worked and that there will not be an effort to try to undercut or reverse the voice of the American people by seeking to bring in a court to involve itself. Let the voters speak, let the votes be counted, and then move forward and respect our democracy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't believe we're going to have 36 days of waiting and looking at hanging chads and the like. It's going to be very different than year 2000. Of course, we have several states that are remarkably close at this stage. So everybody has to be patient. It's probably going to take a couple days, maybe until the end of the week before we know definitively. And it's, as Jim said, once the votes are in, I think it's going to be rather clear cut. I don't see any legal basis for President Trump going to the Supreme Court to try to invalidate the legitimate votes that have been cast in any of these states. But it's hard to predict, of course, what a federal court will do once a plea is made. But in our federalism system, these elections are run by the states. And it looks right now that the states have pretty good control over their vote counting, and we're going to have reliable results, and that's going to determine the outcome of the presidential race.
I would further note that in the litigation we have already seen, the justices have erred on the side of counting votes. So while it's not outside the realm of possibility, and we're already beginning to see massive amounts of litigation pile up in places like Pennsylvania, as with everything this year, I just urge people to be patient. I think it's too soon to tell what the litigation will actually look like at the end of the day.
I think there's one other legal issue to raise here with respect to how this is not going to be like Florida. And that is what's going on right now is not a process of recounting. If you remember the litigation going back to Florida in 2000, it was the question of which ballots were counted, should they have been counted properly, were they not counted properly, the hanging chads and all the rest. What we're talking about here are legitimately submitted on-time ballots that have simply not been counted, in large part because the legislatures of those states did not establish a mechanism, like many other states, for counting them as they came in. And so the reason that this counting is going on is not any kind of recounting. It's simply because the state made the decision not to allow the counting to start before Election Day. And that's going to delay the process, not delaying it with respect to votes coming in, but delaying it with respect to votes that were cast already. The states have a lot of latitude here. The courts have given the states a lot of latitude in the past. And if the court were to decide otherwise, to try to intervene in this system in the next few days, they would really be stepping into a very, very different legal environment with where the case in Florida in 2000 offers no direction.
I think it's a fairly normal process that we're going through now, and that's just counting the initial votes. And I can't imagine a court stopping that. If something happens later in the process, that would be a different question. But now it's just the normal process of counting the votes.
We saw record early and absentee voting in this election. By Election Day, nearly 100 million Americans had already voted, including 2/3 of the voters here in Virginia, where the General Assembly allowed localities to hold early balloting for the first time. What impact did early voting have on this election? And do you think this is a trend that's likely to continue in future elections?
Yeah, I think it's a trend. I think it was a remarkable step forward, to be perfectly honest with you. I think you had more people engaged. People realized that this was something that was very important. The fact that you had the opportunity to cast your vote early, to plan when you did it. You didn't have to, it didn't come down to one day where all of a sudden you could have had an emergency and you couldn't get to cast your ballot. I think this is the way we ought to be using our voting process going forward. In some states, you had more people who voted in advance than voted in the state back in 2016. So I see this as a very positive step forward, and I hope that we will incorporate this in the process going forward.
I also think, though, that it's important to note that this is a particularly difficult year because of the pandemic, and states are going to have to make decisions going forward as to whether or not they want to codify this type of early voting process. Of course, states like Arizona, Colorado, and Oregon, for the better part of a decade, have had an all mail-in ballot system with an in-person option. And what we know out of those states is that that results in high voter turnout. However, what we also know is that in the last 4 years, we've seen concerted efforts by the Republican Party all across the United States to disenfranchise voters. And frankly, it's not in their best interest to increase access to the ballot. And so while I would hope that most states, and I think Virginia is in a good position with the Democratic legislature to implement or in the future to continue to have these types of mail-in systems, I don't know that we should expect to see it across large swaths, particularly of the South.
And the changes that were made to the Virginia law are permanent changes unless those laws are revised. So I think the legislature would have to change for those Virginia laws that have opened up the process to be repealed. And I think by the time they get around to that, the people will be so supportive of the easy way of voting, it'll be very difficult to turn back.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has changed a lot about American life permanently that we never anticipated. And post-pandemic, many of these changes are going to stay in place. We've all learned that we can work very efficiently remotely, more than we ever believed was possible. Those of us in higher education have learned that we can deliver really good quality content virtually for our students. And we've also learned in this election cycle, we can have reliable, well-run elections with different modes of voting. And I think that's going to have a profound effect on the future of how we conduct elections in this country.
I do think we're looking at a pattern that is going to be becoming permanent along the lines of what others have said on the panel. The reality is that when people get used to something, even if they only have it once, it's pretty hard to take it away from them. And so I do think that the pattern that you see here is the pattern that's going to be replicated elsewhere. I think one of the other potential issues here may also be depending on the trajectory of the some of these uncalled Senate races and the runoffs. But if there is a Democratic majority or something along the lines of a 50-50 with a tiebreaker and a Democratic victory for the White House, there might be greater incentive to ramp up some of these mechanisms via federal legislation perhaps via a renewed Voting Rights Act or something along those lines. So even if the states themselves might not be enthusiastic about making these changes permanent, I think there's going to be more pressure as other states do so, and potentially pressure at the national level for greater access.
If I could make one other point, and it's not directly related to your question, but I hope this is one thing that comes out of this election, is that it is clear that there's a lot of division in this country, and that I hope that we take this opportunity to recognize that in order for us to go forward in a positive way, we need to have more dialogue between the major parties and to try to set some of our partisanship aside and work in the best interest of the American people and address these issues and have some dialogue. And hopefully that will come out of this process, a recognition that we need to work together in order to grow our country and not basically go off in two separate camps and fire shots across the way.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I want to take a minute to remind our viewers, if you have questions for our panelists, please submit them in the chat, and we will see them here, and I'll be glad to look through them and ask some of them. Next, COVID-19 has hit the United States harder than any other nation, with more than 231,000 Americans dead since the pandemic began earlier this year. An Associated Press poll yesterday found that it was the #1 concern of Virginia voters. How much of a factor was the coronavirus pandemic and its economic fallout for this election?
I think it was very important. Those numbers, I think, are very accurate. You can't have 230,000 people die and not want to do something about addressing that. And the fact that one of the big issues was that this administration do everything that it could to address that problem clearly has to be a major concern. So I think that drove a lot of people to the polls because this is something that affects all of us, whether you have it or you have people in your family who have it. It was a major issue that has impacted our economy. It has long-term effects. And so I think those polls were absolutely accurate.
I think it helped with turnout of Democrats, but I think a unique thing about President Trump is the people that like him don't move and the people that don't like him don't move. And it really comes down to an issue of turnout. So if you read some of the people interviewed after they voted, you know, if they were voting for Trump, they said he'd done a good job addressing the virus. And if they were not voting for him, they said he had not. So I don't know that it moved a lot of voters. I think it significantly increased the Democratic turnout.
Right. The intensity factor was so important in this election cycle. And the one thing that always held me back from making a very strong, as many of my colleagues did, Biden projection in this election cycle were the polls that had earlier shown that the intensity factor strongly supported President Trump. So you have supporters of this president who genuinely believe that he's done all he could do to handle this pandemic, whether factually accurate or not. That's a deeply held belief. And look at these rallies at the end of the campaign. People were willing to pack together like sardines in a can, thousands of people, and subject themselves to the possibility of a deadly virus, all for Donald Trump. Who else elicits that kind of intense following? And that, I think, was a huge factor in explaining what ended up being, I think, a surprise last night and continues to be a surprise to most of the analysts regarding this outcome.
And the exit polls are really quite clear on this, right? That this really depends on who you are. For Americans here in Virginia and nationally who viewed the coronavirus as being a serious issue, those voters broke for Biden. However, on the other side, when you have the economy as the top issue, those voters broke for Trump. So I think that as has been brought up, for Trump voters, the issue of the coronavirus has not been a major issue for them. But for Biden voters, it was quite a large issue.
To me, it all comes down to this issue of party identification. The choices that people are making are basically the way they view the world. It's through the lenses of where they start out in terms of their partisan loyalty. You're on this team, you're on that team. And if depending on that place where you find yourself, that shapes everything. You hear people supporting the president not only going to rallies without masks and risking their health potentially, but you also hear them saying that the 200,000 number that we have been mentioning here is a fraud, that it's just another example of fake news. And this is one of the challenges that the country is going to face going forward. If you have two different sets of beliefs about what the facts are, it's going to be very hard to imagine a scenario where there's going to be much in the way of compromise. I mean, even when the vaccine emerges, assuming that one that is effective and available widely next year comes to pass, there's still going to be a lot of people who have their doubts about whether or not the experts are telling them the truth and whether or not that this is a legitimate scenario. So when we think about the COVID impact on this election, it's primarily in terms of strengthening views already held. And this is not just with respect to the healthcare aspect, it's also the economic aspect, because even though the objective economic measures have made it very clear we have not come close to coming back to what we have lost in 2020 in terms of GDP or employment or any other economic measure other than the investment community's numbers, it's clear that people aren't seeing it that way. They're seeing it through the partisan lens of, I like Trump, Trump's doing a good job on the economy, and he's doing a good job on COVID, or they don't like Trump, and he's doing a bad job on every measure we can imagine.
Well, that goes to the point I made earlier, is that we have got to have some leadership on both sides of the aisle to come forward to try to address that. It's not going to be done overnight, but we need to make an effort to try to bring people together and have some dialogue, some compromise, some recognition of the fact that we cannot continue along this path. We've got to find a way to work together, or we're all going to go down together.
I think it's also important to note at this intersection of coronavirus and the economy that women and people of color have continued to be disproportionately affected. Women are being pushed out of the economy because of increased mental load at home, childcare duties, as well as just keeping the household going. And Black Americans still face relatively high unemployment numbers compared to white Americans as a result of the coronavirus.
Very good point.
Bringing up the economy again, the Virginia voters in that AP poll said that their number 2 concern in this election was the economy and jobs. That said, what would Trump or Biden wins mean for Virginia's economy? And I'm thinking here not just about the kitchen table economic recovery, which is of course very important, but also about the impact on important sectors to the Commonwealth, like ports and trade or federal defense spending. So what would Trump or Biden do for the economy here in Virginia? What could we expect?
Well, I think that a Biden administration would put even more emphasis on the need to develop a talent pipeline so that we could fill jobs and grow our economy. That is a huge issue here in Virginia. And fortunately, we have members of our delegation who've been fighting for that on the federal level. But I think you would find support for programs to basically help develop our workforce, to address the issue that was mentioned in the Cox statement at the beginning, the digital divide, because we cannot grow our economy unless we've got broadband available in every sector of Virginia. And I think a Biden administration would address that. Amanda referenced something that's also very important in Virginia, and I think we get support here, and that is the issue of childcare and early childhood education. If we don't address that as a priority going forward, we're not going to see our economy grow. We're not going to see women get back in the workforce in the numbers that they need to be. And I think you would find more support at the federal level to aid the states in addressing some of those issues.
I think that with a Biden administration, you would have a more reasonable trade policy, working with our allies, and that through that policy, it would significantly benefit the port. It looks like all this furor that we've had with China, some of it important to do, but it's had very little result. Our trade deficit is where it was when he came into office. On the other hand, in terms of defense spending that's so helpful to Hampton Roads, Trump administration would be stronger on that. I don't know that because of the deficit situation that they would be dramatically stronger, but they would be somewhat stronger in terms of building more ships. He entered office saying that he wanted to have 350 naval ships before he left office, and we're still a little under 300. So I'm sure they would put some emphasis on that.
I think when you talk about the Virginia economy, it's important to recognize that Virginia is sort of in a win-win situation, regardless of whether the Democratic or the Republican nominee ends up in the White House in January. Virginia benefits. Now, there will be differences in terms of different economies. In addition to what's already been said, I think a Biden administration would likely work on renewable energy and create new economic opportunities in Virginia for some of those kinds of industries. But again, on the other side, that is countered by the defense orientation of the Trump administration, which will also create an opportunity for Virginia's economy to benefit there. The large number of federal employees, federal contractors, federal retirees create an extraordinary insulation in the Virginia economy that creates a state, a Commonwealth that's more recession-proof than just about any place in the country. And that stays with us, whatever the partisan configuration of Washington is. And so I don't know that when we think about the economy for the state as a whole, that there is a bad choice here in terms of economic opportunity for Virginia. It's just that certain industries might do a little better here, might do a little better there, depending on which party prevails.
I'll just pick on only one point, which is that getting this economy moving forward in Virginia and throughout the country is going to depend very heavily in the future on getting this pandemic under control. And the administration in Washington has shown no facility for doing that whatsoever. This has been prolonged unnecessarily. We shouldn't be in this situation that we're in right now. Had the president had simply said, how difficult is it to wear a mask, and motivated all his followers, wear a mask, put a MAGA mask on, whatever, we'll all do this together, and employed the resources of the federal government to attack this problem, we wouldn't be in this situation right now. And the long-term effect on the economy, I think, is going to be rather profound. If this president indeed is reelected, which I don't think he's going to be, based on the numbers I'm looking at right now in front of me, and if he continues along the same vein in approaching the pandemic issue, I think we're in for some real trouble.
And tangential to the coronavirus problem, this has really made salient in Virginia, all over Virginia, the issue of affordable housing. And I think under a Biden administration, we have a strong opportunity to see growth in the area of real estate and construction. I think that the Biden administration would be, he's already stated he would be committed to first-time homebuyer credits, but also committed to the idea of shelter as a human right. And we know then that we need some federal help in providing incentives for builders and contractors to build affordable housing for our population here in Virginia.
And to pick up on that one point, Amanda, not only do we have to have more affordable housing, we have to address the fact that right now our housing is so segregated that it impacts us as a society as far as affecting people's educational opportunities, access to a quality life. And some of us are working on some initiatives now that would address that issue, which go down to our land use laws, our zoning laws, and Virginia needs to be aggressively addressing that, because there's some parts of Virginia where this housing is more segregated now than it was 100 years ago. So very good for raising that point.
Okay, I have a question from one of our viewers. What is your view of today's pollsters? Are they serving the voters?
I think we need some post-election analysis to make a good determination about how right or wrong the polls were. At this point, today, where we are this morning, I think that the polls are about where we expected them to be. I don't think that they're any worse than they were in 2016, but I do think where the pollsters went wrong is that in political science, right, we have been talking about this issue of partisan realignment. That is a shakeup of the political parties' coalitions. And we thought that 2016 might be a fluke. I think that yesterday demonstrated that 2016 was absolutely not a fluke, that the Republican Party has done a very good job of moving white voters with high school diplomas into their voting bloc. And we're also seeing some inroads among young Black voters and some Latino populations for the Republican Party. We really need to get into the post-election analysis looking at good political science data sets like the American National Election Study or the CCES that will tell us a whole lot more about what that realignment looks like. And that will help pollsters better plan for their 2022 and 2024 efforts.
I guess we need a poll on whether we need polls.
I'll say something in defense of the polls, even though it's not terribly popular. In 2016, the national polls were remarkably accurate. They were more accurate than they were actually in 2012, but the divergence between the outcome in the Electoral College and the popular vote is what led a lot of people to say, oh, the polls were wrong. They didn't predict the outcome. What went wrong were some state-level polls in a few of those critical states in the upper Midwest, which clearly got it wrong. But the overall pattern actually was quite strong, and the polls are projecting, have projected pretty close to what the national popular outcome would be. And what the outcomes will be in a number of the states. I'll make a plug. We have a poll, the Schar School, the Washington Post. We had Virginia by 11 points. It's probably going to be 11 points by the time all the votes are counted. So there's a lot more good going on there. But the divergence between the Electoral College in some cases and the popular vote, I think, is what causes a lot of people to say, well, the polls are just not very good.
We also have to have people to be honest about responding to polls, quite honestly, because we've had experiences here in Virginia where people will say one thing to the pollsters, and I'm going back to the Doug Wilder race where the polls showed one thing, people said something, but then when they went in the voting booth, they did something else. So it's going to be a critical
that was even worse, Jim, because those were the exit polls. People saying that they voted a certain way.
You got to be honest.
Yes.
One other thing I would say about polling is that I think a lot of people expect too much of polls. I think we have to recognize, and those of us who do polling, we know this, but it's not necessarily translated to the journalists or the news consumers who imagine these polls are something approaching gospel. We're talking about a snapshot in time, which is useful if there isn't an October surprise. In 2016, for example, the decision by the FBI to restart the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails came after many of those state-level polls that caused a divergence. I think that if you look at the coverage of the Hillary Clinton campaign during that last week before the election, that was the most negative period for her. The polling numbers went south nationally compared to where they were before the FBI started their reinvestigation. And so in 2016, one of the big factors of why the states were wrong is because they thought, okay, we've done enough polling of Michigan, we don't need to poll those last few days. And there was this impact. But for ordinary people looking at these surveys, it's really, I think, more useful to think of it sort of like a football scenario where you would say that the odds of a team winning might be by 3 points or by a touchdown. And the reality, though, is that on any given Sunday, things do come out differently than one anticipates. And polling is like that, too. It's an approximation. There's a margin of error. Even when people are trying as best they can to develop a professional survey with a representative sample, you're still up against the possibility that it might be one of those times that the sample isn't that representative. And particularly as we're thinking about people who are not responding to pollsters when they call, people who might not be telling the truth, that's a whole nother set of uncertainties that are being baked into this model of polls. And so I guess I might be a little sympathetic to pollsters myself. We conduct polls at Mary Washington, but the reality is that people are expecting too much of them, and they don't appreciate these limitations. We understand that at 7 p.m. on Sunday, it doesn't look like what we thought at noon on Sunday for NFL. Why do we think that pollsters are any different? There are too many unknowns with any of these things.
And as a science, I would note that we learn, right? And we learned a lot from the 2016 election. The best polls this year that I think are going to turn out to be the most accurate learn to weigh not just by education, but for example, Pew Research Center weighed by education within demographic groups. And so in 2016, we weren't weighting by education. We learned from that experience. And I think the question that we have to figure out is what will we learn from this experience that will help improve the polls in the next election cycle?
And I think
sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Many polls are accurate. I mean, we know that from campaigns that we've seen their polls, and many of them are right on target. And I think the same is true with the public polls, and it is just at a specific time. But one thing that I do wonder is if there is a Trump impact, particularly in those Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin states where people are making a transition away from their traditional party, the Democratic Party. Maybe one spouse is voting one way, the other spouse is voting the other. And I think there may be some individuals who are not giving the honest answer. But I think it may be just a Trump issue, as it was an issue with dramatic change in Virginia with Governor Wilder.
Let me just point out quickly, I think there were 4 or 5 different state level polls in Virginia that all had it at 10, 11, or 12%. And right now it's just over 10%, with about 6% of the votes still coming in, which are probably going to trend to Biden and make it right there, exactly with what all the state level polls in Virginia projected. So we can at least say here we've got some good polling going on.
But we're honest in Virginia. It's those other states we're talking about.
So this particular phenomenon you're talking about is referred to as a Bradley effect. And from what I'm reading from pollsters, there isn't reason to believe that what we're experiencing is a Bradley effect. It could actually be the case that because Trump supporters are less trusting of the media, they're less likely to be responsive to pollsters. And so it could be a problem of picking up the phone, not a problem of being truthful once they're on the phone.
Good
Right.
point.
It's also some of them just don't want to admit that they support Donald J. Trump, right? I mean, there's that sort of social stigma that they're afraid of by admitting to their friends or family who they voted for, but in the secrecy of the voting booth or the mail-in ballot or whatever, they in their heart they're with Trump, and Trump has in 2 election cycles now somewhat outperformed, right, expectations and what some of the polls had projected. So the shy Trump voter perhaps is a reality.
It's very scary that there are people out there thinking things and feel emboldened by things that he's said and done to come out now and be a little open about it. And that's one thing that concerns me, quite honestly.
Yeah, and I'm sure we all do endorse what you said, Jim, before about the need for parties to start talking to each other and come together and get beyond the highly partisan environment that we're in. This election outcome as it stands right now doesn't give me a lot of hope that we're going to get there fast. It's going to be a process. It's going to take time.
Yeah, well, there's an opportunity for somebody to get some chapters written about profiles and courage. Leadership is about standing up and taking a tough position, especially when it's not the popular position, but it needs to be done. So hopefully we'll have some people on both sides of the aisle who are willing to stand up and do the right thing.
Yeah.
Speaking to that point, we have a viewer question and touches exactly on Jim's comment earlier about the need for the parties to work together. This person asks, is there a long view for a third middle of the road party at some point in time? Could that exist?
It's not likely because of the rules of the game. We have single member pluralities where we elect one person out of a district, and this really forces the combination of weak parties and the elimination of weak parties, resulting in a 2-party system. So we'd fundamentally have to alter the structure of our elections in order to see the rise of competitive third parties.
And of course, we'd have to do this in 50 states because you have these mechanisms that are set up at the state level. You really can't imagine this happening in large part because the political parties are themselves so fluid. If we talked about the Republican Party of 10 years ago, it was a Republican Party that was committed to free trade. It was a Republican Party that was committed to a muscular promotion of democracy. It was a Republican Party that was committed to balanced budgets. It was a Republican Party that was committed to personal responsibility from the elected officials that represent the party. All of these things are not the way that we would describe the Republican Party today. Donald Trump has remade the Republican Party in his own image in a way that is a great variance from what Republican Party vision and perspectives and elected officials would have put forward 10 years ago. And so as a result of that, you can see that if you want to be a third party movement, the most effective way to do that is to simply try to take over the apparatus of one of the existing parties because it is so easy to do. So much easier than trying to build a system from the ground up to operate in 50 states. The Ross Perot movement, the most effective third-party movement of the last 100 years, basically depended on money that he put forward when he was running, but there wasn't really anything that lasted at the national level or at the individual state levels. It's just not a mechanism that seems likely to get us anywhere in this country.
Well, let me pick up on one thing that I know you're probably going to ask about it later, but I may as well bring it up now because I think it ties into that. And that is the movement on the whole redistricting effort. If we, in fact, come up with a plan now that has districts that are drawn to reflect communities of interest, conciseness, consistency, things that are the actual ways you ought to be drawing districts, you're going to have hopefully more competitive races. And that will hopefully draw people to try to find some common ground, to recognize that they don't have to appeal to one end of the party as opposed to another, but they have to have a broader appeal, a broader message. And then hopefully that will move us in a direction that these two parties will recognize that we need to find some common ground and that there's some issues that are broader than just our own special interest.
Jim, you bring up a good point. The Virginia voters also approved a constitutional amendment yesterday creating a bipartisan redistricting commission, and that was an effort to combat gerrymandering. But that also relies on both parties playing nicely together. If they can't, and they can't agree on drawing the legislative districts, then it's going to wind up being decided by the state Supreme Court. So how likely is this bipartisan redistricting commission to be successful?
Well, it goes back to the point that people have to stand up and say, we need to try to find some bipartisan solutions to our issues. It's going to require leadership. It's not going to be easy, but that has to be done. And this provides an opportunity. That amendment was not perfect. I think it could have gone further, but the point is it was a step in the right direction. And we need to take advantage of this and to basically insist, especially going into an election year next year in Virginia, we need to be raising these issues with people who are running for governor and lieutenant governor and attorney general. What are you going to do to try to bring some bipartisan approach to issues that are facing Virginia? How are you going to be a leader that's different from what we've had sometimes in the past? It's not going to be easy. And I realize that it's an uphill battle, but you don't get uphill unless you take the first 2 or 3 steps in that direction.
Go ahead, man.
Ben,
We've talked a lot about bipartisanship and working together, and there are a couple of models that still work. In Washington, the National Defense Authorization Bill is worked out. It's one of the few bills that passes every year, and it goes through the committee process, unlike most bills. And it's ultimately worked out by 4 major conferees. And right now you have a very conservative senator, Senator Inhofe, who chairs the Senate Armed Services Committee, a fairly liberal Democratic chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith. But they get together and work it out. They work collegially. And I think that that's one of the reasons that the defense budget stays strong. And another smaller example would be, I would say, the budget process here in Virginia. You have senior legislators of both parties who have significant influence over the budget and work out the differences. So there are models you can use, you just have to want to do it.
Yep.
I'm generally not optimistic about bipartisan cooperation in these highly divided times, but it strikes me that the gerrymandering issue may be one of the places where the Democrats and Republicans can find common cause. And here's why. The one thing that both parties would like to avoid is a decision being made in the courts. That is so unpredictable. It is such a high-risk strategy that it is to be avoided at all costs. And so this is one of those rare opportunities, it seems to me, for the self-interest of Democratic and Republican lawmakers to coincide. And that may be the real impact of this gerrymandering reform, this idea that the alternative of not working together is so unpalatable. Well, maybe they can be forced to cross partisan lines on this one issue once every 10 years.
Yeah, that sort of reminds me of an approach that I talk about, and that's the Tina Turner Proud Mary approach. We can either do this rough or we can do it easy. It's going to be up to them to decide which direction they're going to move in. So let's take the easy one, which is working together, as opposed to letting somebody else impose it on us.
I would also note that bipartisan redistricting commissions have been quite successful in other states. And
Yep.
so we have models for how this does actually work. And we know that when we can increase competition in districts, we can increase voter turnout, which can lead to a more moderate, middle of the road candidate ultimately being elected. And so I think that we can be optimistic given that this is a process that has worked well in other states.
On that note, we have time for one final quick question. We have seen several historians and political analysts this year say that Americans are now the most divided we've ever been since the Civil War. Is this true, or is it hyperbole? And is there a way to heal the divide?
I think it's true in some ways because, as I said earlier, you've had some people who felt now emboldened to come out and share some views that are very divisive and use dog whistles to various groups to get out there and do some things. We need people to stand up and say, let's live up to the principles of this country. We're all created equal. We all need to work together. We need to find out how we can coexist in a peaceful world where everybody's given the opportunity to develop to their full potential, and that we will do much better as a nation moving in that direction. If we want to continue to be the leader in the world, we have to live up to those principles. But it is going to take leadership. People are going to have to stand up and take some tough positions in order to get this done. So hopefully this will be a wake-up call to do that.
To me, this is one of the consequences of the Donald Trump presidency in the way that it has unfolded. If you look at most presidents, they try to reach out beyond their base pretty consistently across their 4 years. They want to figure out a way to be reelected, to be sure, but they also want to pass legislation. And oftentimes in Washington, that requires at least some buy-in from the other party. What's been really striking to me about the Donald Trump presidency is the extent to which the divisions that exist in this country were sort of nurtured or exacerbated by a lot of the policy choices that were made along the way. And that creates sort of a heightened sensitivity to us versus them. If you look at the George W. Bush presidency or the Barack Obama presidency, Reagan or the first President Bush, over and over again, you see a very different strategy of governing and of campaigning. And it's also an appeal in many cases in these previous elections to our more aspirational motives rather than the sort of more crass transactional, the world will be facing an apocalyptic ruin if the other side prevails. And, you know, it's clear that that kind of narrative is going to be intensified in an election season. And so perhaps as we get beyond the election season, we'll see more of an opportunity for cooler heads to prevail, for the kind of vision of how America really doesn't work divided. The consequences of this division might become more and more apparent. There's no doubt about it. You know, the more America is divided, the better for Russia and for China and for other adversaries around the world. And so they'd like it to keep going. But we have to come to the good judgment that we simply cannot afford the costs of this division from the point of view of our nation's future.
Yeah, we may be intensely divided right now, but I think we have to put it in perspective. I've heard this before in the 1990s and the Clinton era, especially during the impeachment episode. There were so many analyses suggesting that the country was irreparably divided. The intense polarization in the country was tearing us apart. I'm plenty old enough to remember the period of the American war in Vietnam and how divided this country was at that time. We came through these time and again. So I'm not going to suggest it's necessarily cyclical, but if you look at American public opinion, people's attitudes on core issues, the polarization is not as deep as it has been amplified, I think, by much of the coverage of American politics and much of the analysis. Many more Americans tend to be moderate than deeply far right or far left. So I think what Jim is saying is absolutely right. With the right leadership, with people who are political leaders and thought leaders who can drive discussion in this country away from the intensified polarization that's been generated largely by the presence of this president of the United States, we can come out of this. And I think we can come out of it very successfully.
I think we'll come out of it, and we will. I do think a big piece of it is the 24/7 media coverage, which we used to not have. We used to all sit down at 6:30 and watch the news as a nation almost together. And with the 24/7, with certain networks taking one party's position, the other network taking the others, that has been very divisive. But I agree with Dr. Farnsworth. We have to get beyond Trump, whether it's now or 4 years from now, to really know if the division is going to remain, because he, for whatever reason, enjoys dividing the country and does it very effectively.
Can I make one comment about this? And that is that this is not a uniquely American trend. Internationally, we are seeing democratic backsliding. We today as Americans are less free than we were 10 or 20 years ago. And worldwide, this democratic backsliding is accompanied by the rise of nationalistic candidates like Donald Trump. I think the thing that Americans do have in common and that we can work on is commitment to democratic values. And we can measure those outcomes. And so I think we have to get beyond Donald Trump. I think we have to get beyond nationalism. But I think globally, we need to be talking about this issue as well.
Amen.
Very quickly, one of our viewers has put in a quick question, and I will just ask each of you to take a turn and field this. What do you ultimately think the presidential outcome will be?
Who dares go first?
I'll go first.
When I got up this morning, I thought it was going to be Trump. And then as the morning went along, it appears it's Biden. And it might change several more times before it's over.
Yeah, I would say I think at this point it seems to be moving toward Biden. I hope that's the case. I hope that's how it moves. But we have to wait for all of the votes to be counted, and then we go from there.
Amanda?
I think that Biden has more paths to victory. Assuming that Biden takes Nevada, which I think is a safe assumption, he has 19 potential combinations to win the Electoral College, compared to Trump, who only has 13 paths forward and 3 scenarios that leave us with a tie. So at this point, I think that Biden has the best chance of getting the right number, or that is the right winning combination of states.
Mark?
I'm betting on 271 electors for Joe Biden, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan. Therefore, he doesn't need Pennsylvania.
Stephen?
Yeah, I'm agreeing with the consensus here. The tide is clearly going in Biden's direction. When you're thinking about the people who voted early, they're going to be disproportionately Democratic, and in large part because the president told his own supporters not to trust the mail. And so the reality is that the legitimately cast ballots in these states that were not allowed to count their ballots ahead of time are going to be more pro-Biden. And the margins in a number of these states are close enough, it seems to me, that that Biden, if you were betting right now, you'd put your money on Biden, not Trump.
Okay. I want to thank all of our panelists for an interesting and lively discussion this morning. Thank you to our sponsor, Cox Cable, and thank you to all of you for watching. Please visit virginiabusiness.com for ongoing coverage of the election's impact on business in the Commonwealth. Thank you. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to be on with all of you. You did great.
Take care, everybody. Good to see you.